the same again to get on there?
You gotta go to the club
Okay,
website.
just write it
Yeah, I'll
down.
write it in there for you. Okay, you can start anytime. It's there we go. We're ready.
You're right?
Yeah, we're good.
Greetings, we are starting now. So what you see on this first screen about modulation, it looks like there's some sine waveform and some sine waves picking up. This is analog stuff, and you know that the whole world is gone digital. Your cell phone, your television at home, and most of the electronic equipment is all digital. Well, eventually we live in a mad world. MAD. It stands for mixed analog and digital. So why do we need to worry about analog stuff and we ever will? Because us humans, we only have analog sensors. Or mouse can produce sound waves. Those sound waves, they propagate away as variable intensity pressure waves. Or ears can sense those sound waves. Or eyes can see light at various intensities and different hues. So since the human operator will always be an analog being, we have to start our ham radio equipment with an analog interface. And then somewhere later on, sophisticated ham radio equipment turns into digital processing, but we will get there a little later. So right now I just want to remind you of two formulae from your high school studies. Now, you do not just look at all this that maybe is this a future test question coming up. I will not get you into any kind of mathematics or deep down into equations and derivations. But sometimes it's easier to understand what's going on if we just have an equation on the board. So this ET in brackets, T stands for the time variable. So all what's happening in the radio electronic equipment, it's happening over time. So this is a time wave, and it's a sinusoidal wave. This capital A, capital A is the amplitude of the sinusoidal wave. And then the sine wave has an argument. In the brackets, we have 2 pi f. The 2 pi is the 360 degrees angle in a complete circle. So you just think of a hydrogenerating station as the water rushes down to the turbine and the generator turns, and it has coils that they cut through magnetic force fields. And each time that hydrogenerator turns one more rotation, it generates another wave of electricity. That's a sinusoidal wave. So in the brackets, what we have is called the angle. And the angle has two constituent components. The 2 pi f part is called the angular velocity. How fast in time does the whole circle repeat itself? So the 2 pi f is the angular velocity. Velocity times time. Plus phi. Phi would be initial phase. So imagine that this is the rotor of a generator. This rotates like this, and it has an initial position before it all starts up. So why is it important to know those equations? First of all, I like to point out that sine 2 pi ft plus initial phase or cos 2 pi ft plus an initial phase. They are really not specified as sine waves and cos waves. But both of those equations, they represent a sinusoid. So the mathematical way of writing a sinusoid is based on using a sine wave or a cos wave. So once we pass this and we accept that a sinusoid has an amplitude, the amplitude is the largest value of the instantaneous value of that wave, or the wave can run up to. And this amplitude may be changed. This amplitude may be added to it or subtracted from it. So when you add and subtract from the amplitude of a sine wave, you eventually impress something onto this wave. And the process of impressing one wave upon a carrier wave, that is what we call modulation. So modulation has different varieties, and amplitude modulation is one mode that is a valid ham radio mode. If you have a ham radio transceiver, an old one or a new one, really they always have an amplitude modulation mode. So amplitude modulation will be performed later on by modifying this amplitude. Then we look at the brackets. The brackets would represent the angle. So anything you change between those brackets would therefore be called angle modulation. Well, angle modulation has two aspects. You can modify the frequency, or you can modify the phase angle. By doing so, you may perform frequency modulation or phase modulation. Frequency modulation is again a valid form of modulation used in ham radio. Those Bofang radios you were talking about, they all perform frequency modulation. The other aspect of angle modulation, and would modify the phase angle, that is called phase modulation. Well, phase modulation per se is not a mode implemented in ham radio, but phase modulation is more like an intermediate step in performing an outcome. So phase modulation is used really widely when we actually perform digital modulation a little bit later on. So let me just roll this up now. Let me see the two sinusoids. And those three bold statements there. What is amplitude modulation again? You would add the instantaneous value of your intelligence to the amplitude of the carrier. Now I introduce two buzzwords, intelligence and carrier. Well, intelligence may be something that is worthwhile to be transmitted. That's your voice. As you push to talk and you talk to the microphone, your voice is the intelligence. Also, an image, a picture is intelligence. As we have one amateur in our club who is broadcasting the amateur television. So, intelligence may be voice, it may be a picture, or in the industry, intelligence may be a pressure, a temperature, the pH of a solution, or the flow of steam in a conduit, or any of those physical parameters, they may all be considered intelligence. So for us, intelligence predominantly will be our voice. So the human voice generates pressure waves. Those pressure waves are captured by a microphone. The microphone is going to translate those pressure waves into electric waves of equivalent frequency. But the electric waves, they will swing into the positive and negative direction. So they would have positive instances and negative instances. So those positive instances, when they add over the top of the amplitude of the sine. So this is the horizontal axis that's running with time. Above it, everything is positive. Below it, everything is negative. So this represents the carrier wave. The carrier wave would swing away from the reference axis for 0 voltage for maximum value. This value is the amplitude of a carrier wave. And this amplitude could be further increased or it could be depressed downwards by the intelligence. So we are impressing our voice over the top of the amplitude of a carrier wave, and we cause the carrier to increase or decrease its amplitude. Keep in mind again, the sine and cos are just the mathematical ways to represent the sinusoid. The sinusoid is the smoothest possible wave in science and physics. And now what we see here in this picture are two electronic instruments. Those electronic instruments, they are absolutely widely used in ham radio and in the industry as well. And their prices, they came down from the $10,000 a piece value down into the hundreds of dollars. A pretty good oscilloscope you can buy with just $100 and a very useful spectrum analyzer one can buy for about $100 to $200, $300. Well, what is an oscilloscope? An oscilloscope has a time base. The time base would represent the horizontal axis of the running time. And anything that happens in time, something that goes up or down or oscillates, you can represent it on the screen of the oscilloscope. So an oscilloscope performs a time domain display. It displays in the time domain. But besides the time domain, there's a frequency domain as well. Just think about, they will give you several examples. A family radio, that's a small little device where you buy it anywhere for $20 to $30. It's channelize the radio. You switch the channels from channel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 13 or so. You will move that radio to a new slot in frequency. Think about a CB radio, 24-channel CB radios. People are still using those. As you pop the channel selector, you change the frequencies. You are performing a change in the frequencies. You operate in the frequency domain. Cable television also operates in the frequency domain because you have hundreds and hundreds of channels coming in, and then those channels, sometimes they are analog, sometimes they are digital. They are both coming to your house. If you have a very, very old-fashioned analog television set, you connect it to the cable television input, you will still get a large number of channels. So the local cable television company transmits a frequency division multiplex packet of signals. So anything that is spread out in frequency, it's set to operate in the frequency domain. So an oscilloscope is the instrument that displays in the time domain, and a spectrum analyzer is an instrument that displays in the frequency domain. In the time domain, you see the instantaneous values of a wave. Again, the sine wave is the nicest and easiest to be used for the purpose of explaining and demonstrating. So a sine wave has a time period. That's the length of time it takes for the wave to return to the same exact value. So the wave starts here at zero crossing. From zero, it would swing to a positive peak. Again, drops down, crosses zero, would swing to a negative peak. It would then further evolve and would run into another zero crossing. It would start to rise again. This length in time is called a time period, and a time period can be also signified with the flow angle, and one complete oscillation of a wave. One complete time period would be equivalent to a flow angle of 360 degrees or 2 pi radians. So something like this is what you see on the oscilloscope. Well, a ham radio itself has many different test points, and you can test a ham radio even by not even opening it up, just by connecting an oscilloscope across the load, across the antenna input. and you would see the wave that corresponds in time to what we are transmitting. A spectrum analyzer would just show spikes or sticks. The magnitude of those spikes would correspond to something called the RMS value of a wave. So a wave has an instantaneous value, it has a peak value, but insofar as how much work can this wave do. Suppose a 60 Hertz sine is fed to a heater, and the heater will heat up. So work is done there, energy is converted from electrical energy to heat energy. And you can heat up that heater with direct current, you can heat up that heater with positive going spikes and negative going spikes as well. So what the effective value of a sine wave would be is a value that is equivalent to how much DC1 needs to develop the same amount of power. Well, this effective value is chosen by the makers of spectrum analyzers to be represented here. And in a broad spectrum of signals, the instantaneous values of the various frequency components are very different. And the effective values of the frequency components are very, very different. They are so different that sometimes they are 1,000 times or 10,000 times or 100,000 times over each other. So you would need a really big piece of paper to represent, say, 1,000 millivolts, and next to it a signal which is only a single millivolt, 1,000 times smaller. So what we use, or what we do, we take the logarithm decimal base of the signal amplitude, multiplied by 10, and this is called a decibel. So there is a formula, again, that's very handy to know, and probably this came up in your studies about antennas and transmission lines. That's 10 times the logarithm of the power level divided over by one single milliwatt as a reference power level. This is called a dBm. This m is a reminder that we reference the power to the milliwatt. So makers of spectrum analyzers, they chose to represent the effective value of a wave, which is in turn proportional to active power. By the way, there is no such thing as RMS power. You may talk about the RMS root mean square of effective value of the voltage, and the root mean square of effective value of the current, and you multiply voltage and current, of course, then you'll get power. So when you multiply the RMS voltage with the RMS value of the current, what you get is not called the RMS power. There is no such thing. So the RMS voltage multiplied by the RMS current would yield the average power. And the average power of different frequency components expressed in dBm is what the spectrum analyzer would display. So those are the two very important domains in electronics and also in ham radio, time domain and frequency domain, and those are the two pieces of instrumentation used to operate in those domains. Something went wrong. There's no more coming up.
Is it? Did you bring it up on the thing here again? Bring it up on here. You might have to pull it up again and bring it up.
Let me try. It needs to be blank pages. Turn this off. This year's revision. Have to go a bit closer. Our second one, 2015. This is the current revision. And it's a PDF file. And let's open it again. And And we are in business again, hopefully. Okay, here we are. Next, let's just talk about amplitude modulation. So again, what is amplitude modulation? A sinusoid, which is definitely it is generated in your ham radio. Whatever type and version of a ham radio you'll buy, it will always have an oscillator, and this oscillator will generate a sinusoid. And this sinusoid is the carrier wave that will be then ready to go way to travel a long way for it. And this carrier wave would have an amplitude, and when the amplitude is modified in step with the modulating intelligence, then we perform amplitude modulation. Well, amplitude modulation has different aspects. One extremely widely used aspect is telegraphy. CW stands for continuous wave. A continuous wave is being interrupted by a telegraph P. And this is amplitude modulation because the amplitude is really changed between no amplitude at all, 0 voltage for the carrier, to the total maximum power output of the carrier. So telegraphy is one form of amplitude modulation. Amplitude modulation proper, well, amplitude modulation proper is performed by, if you think of that formula of the sinusoid, where E brackets time equals capital A amplitude times either sine or cos of 2 pi ft plus initial phase. That capital A that can be measured in volts. And those volts now are being added and subtracted from. You add or subtract to it or from it the amplitude or the instantaneous value of the intelligence that's coming out microphone after some amplification. When the ham radio performs this process of impressing the radio frequency carrier on its amplitude with the audio frequency intelligence, the physical process is called multiplication. You multiply two waves that they are mathematically represented as sinusoids. Now this is what's coming up. It's a very important statement. It's really note to remember is that when you multiply two waves in the time domain, you alter the frequency domain of the outcome. So multiplication in the time domain would always lead to addition and subtraction in the frequency domain. So that's why you really need to be aware of the time domain and of the frequency domain, because all waves modulated and otherwise, they always have this dual representation. You can represent them with an oscilloscope to see how do they change in time. And you can also represent them as in one given instant in time, any moment in time, a wave is made up of very many constituent components. And those constituent components that they result by amplitude modulation, they are the two initial waves, the intelligence and the carrier. They both go through the modulator. Then the sum, and then the difference. So you add the two and you subtract the two. But of course the carrier wave is always the highest frequency wave. It has several megahertz frequency, and the audio wave, the human voice, has frequency components ranged out from 300 hertz to say 3400 hertz. This is the telephone company standard. When you place a telephone call on your cell phone, your voice is shaped into the domain of 300 to 3400 hertz. In ham radio, it was found that those higher frequency components in your voice, 3400 hertz or so, they would just put extra burden on the processing equipment. So most ham radio equipment, they further restrain the voice bandwidth from 300 hertz down to 3000 hertz or even only 2500 hertz. So this is called the audio bandwidth. So suppose you are trying to tune up your ham radio, to match it to the antenna. Well, one way to do is that you push to talk, you activate your PTV, you switch on the microphone, and then you whistle into the microphone. By whistling into the microphone, well, you, the human, you generate a sinusoid. Its sine wave, maybe at 800 hertz or 1 kilohertz, goes through the microphone into the modulator. So suppose your radio is set to operate on a frequency of 14 megahertz, and by whistling into the microphone, you put your 1 kilohertz into the modulator. And the modulator, being fed with a carrier wave at 14 megahertz, would then allow the 14 megahertz, a part of it, to come through. Would allow a small part of the 1 kilohertz to go through, and will also add and subtract. So there will be a component at 14 megahertz plus 1 megahertz, and 14 megahertz minus 1 kilohertz rather. So the sum is called the upper sideband, and the difference is called the lower sideband. So amplitude modulation would lead to a carrier, an upper sideband, and a lower sideband component. And the audio frequency component would be all lost. It will be diminishingly small because the filtering effect of the radio frequency equipment. So that's just a mathematical possibility that some audio would go through the modulator, but in real life it's all attenuated. So now the amplitude modulated wave has three actual components. One component is the carrier as it was. The other component is the sum of the carrier frequency and the intelligence. And the third component is the difference, the upper sideband and the lower sideband. This is happening each time you tune your car radio tuner to an AM radio station, which we have in the area. Suppose you are driving down Interstate 75 and approaching the Mackinac Bridge, and you want to know the weather. The frequencies are all posted there, and you tune to the AM weather channel to listen to the weather, and what's coming into your radio is a carrier, the upper sideband and the lower sideband. And your radio can deal with this to demodulate, to do the reverse process of modulation to give you the original intelligence. Now we just look to an amplitude modulated wave from which we eliminate the carrier. You take the carrier out altogether. So what there is left is just the sum component and the difference component. So the sum component is called the upper sideband, and the difference component is the lower sideband. And since there are only two sidebands but no carrier, we would call this a dual sideband signal, or a DSB. Well, DSB ham radios, they were and they are built, but you need an advanced license for that. If you have an advanced license, you can build your own equipment, and there are certain extreme applications at extreme ends of ham radio and microwaves, or so, where it's a big deal to even come up with a dual sideband modulated signal. But a ham radio that you buy off the shelf from one of the big makers of ham radio equipment, Yaesu, ICOM, Camwood, and many others. Well, those big makers, they do not produce dual sideband transceivers. So dual sideband transceivers are in the domain of the experimenter. However, dual sideband signals, they are very well present in the ham radio, just they are further processed. are further processed, and one of the two sidebands are eliminated, either the upper sideband or the lower sideband. And only one sideband is maintained. What is left is called a single sideband signal. So now we have amplitude modulation proper, dual sideband, and single sideband. Take dual sideband as a procedure, as a building block toward single sideband. And what is the reason we have those different kind modulations? Well, the reason is that in ham radio, our ultimate goal is to make a long distance contact. To contact an amateur somewhere in Europe or Africa or New Zealand. And over years, us ham radio operators and the designers of ham radio equipment, they learned that really single sideband equipment increases the range of a ham radio a great deal. So the range of an AM radio, ham radio, is very reduced. So why do we still bother with it? Because for that rich sound. So when you use an amplitude modulated excuse me, your ham radio with the AM mode is there. You can activate it, you can make an AM ham radio contact, and it would sound so rich and so nice. It's like telephone quality signals. Opposite to that, single sideband does not sound all that well. Sometimes it's not intelligible, and it takes the skill of an operator to tune that radio until the signal appears clearly. So a single sideband signal will never sound as pleasant as an AM signal, but it would increase the range of your ham radio by many thousand miles.
I don't understand how the dual sideband cannot use a carrier. How does it work if it doesn't use a carrier?
Even a little schematic with Mono.
Yeah.
So we are headed that way.
Yeah, okay.
Hang with me. That blue insert, what you see is, well, that is the time domain display of something that could be a data transmission or Morse code. So there are short dots, spaces in between, and longer dashes. So this is how CW would appear on the oscilloscope. Further down, we have a sinusoid. The sinusoidal intelligence, maybe at 1 kilohertz, it may be you whistling into the microphone. And when this sinusoid is being added on the top of the amplitude of the carrier, remember that the instantaneous value of the intelligence would swing positive and negative. So when it's positive, it would aid the amplitude of the carrier. When it's negative, it would oppose it. So what would result is called the envelope. And the AM envelope for sinusoidal modulation is drawn on there, but that's a sketch drawn up by an artist. A technician would see an amplitude modulated radio on the oscilloscope. This is how the oscilloscope would display. Now, why is it that this wave here touches down to the horizontal axis to a total signal cancellation, and here we only have partial signal cancellation? This is called 100% modulation, and this is used a lot even by commercial broadcasters. Each time when commercials come through, then something called overbearing is happening at the transmitter. They will always modulate their carrier to the maximum, just to give you a very loud commercial. As you talk to the microphone, you can talk softly or you can talk really loudly. The more loudly you talk, the more you achieve depths of modulation. So how far those values they go, and when they go all the way down to the horizontal axis, and the oscilloscope view looks like that, and then the depths of modulation is total, or this can be called 100% modulation. for the purpose of testing a ham radio or a commercial radio or a broadcaster, usually use 30% modulation, not total depth. So that was the amplitude modulated wave viewed on an oscilloscope if either the operator whistles into the microphone or you outright use a 1 kilohertz test generator to simulate the intelligence. Now we pull out our spectrum analyzer, and the spectrum analyzer displays the amplitude modulated wave, and in the middle there is this carrier wave. And above it, a kilohertz 2 or 3 above, there is the upper sideband, and as many kilohertz below, there is the lower sideband. So what is the great characteristic of an amplitude modulated wave? The carrier wave is always there. It never changes. The carrier component is eternally present in your signal. So you grab your microphone and you push to talk. But you don't talk. You even hide the mic to not pick up any noise. The instant you push that key, you broadcast your carrier wave with the maximum power available to you. Wherever you set the output level of your ham radio, that much power, it could be 10 watts, 30 watts, 50, 100 watts of power is leaving your ham radio into the antenna, is being radiated away. But only by holding that key and not talking, you are really not transmitting any intelligence. So what is it you do? Maybe you just indicate your presence. Somebody somewhere in a distant country would just be able to detect that carrier, and he'll say, wait a minute, somebody here is trying to tune up. I better watch this frequency because sooner or later he will call CQ. But at first, you just broadcast the carrier. So the carrier is a dummy. It has no intelligence in it. Now you start to talk to the microphone, and suddenly your voice power is aiding and opposing this carrier. So the AM wave has extra components that they appear. The upper sideband and the lower sideband appears there because energy is drawn from the sound wave, which is amplified as an electric wave, which is then fed to a stage called a modulator. So the modulator combines the carrier power with the power of the amplified modulating intelligence. So those side bands are the only components that they carry your intelligence. This is why it was decided that we will try to remove this dummy from the middle. The dummy carrier does not really carry intelligence. So the procedure is that you can either produce phase cancellation, merge that carrier with a signal of the same frequency, same amplitude, but exactly opposite phase. So when one signal would swing in the positive direction, the matching signal would swing in the negative direction, and the two would totally cancel each other. So one can eliminate the carrier by phase cancellation. And the electronic stage that performs that is called a balanced modulator. So a balanced modulator is used to eliminate the otherwise dummy carrier to only radiate the sidebands, because the intelligence is just hidden into the sideband. But wait a minute, the upper sideband and the lower sideband, they have the identical amount of intelligence in them. They have the identical amount. If you manage to pick up one of the two, the upper sideband or the lower sideband, whichever one you wish, that you can totally demodulate the signal and hear the voice as it was transmitted. So that led to the development of single sideband technology, because DSB is even wasting the power. So you have only so much power. Now, if all of the carry is eliminated, suddenly your power budget will gain, say, 100 watts. If you eliminate one of the sidebands, your power budget did gain another 25 watts. So now you have 135 watts extra available power in your equipment, which you can all invest into the only one chose to transmit. So as you see this on the spectrum analyzer, the two sideband signals are smaller, but you invest the power that otherwise goes into the dummy carrier, and you invest the power that otherwise goes into the other sideband, all into this one component. Now you have a component this powerful. That's how single sideband transmission increases the range, because you have this advantage that all of your available power is put there where it matters, to a single component that carries the intelligence. And there are auxiliary benefits also. Because, you know, noise is everywhere present. Noise in the form of static, man-made noise, even noise generated in the equipment by the random motion of the electrons, and electrons crossing the p-n junction of a semiconductor, electrons that they recombine with holes, and all of those processes, they create noise. So in an AM signal, the signal bandwidth is always merged by the noise bandwidth. As you tune your radio, you have a variable frequency tunable filter. Imagine that you have an old-fashioned camera with a viewfinder, and as you turn your head, your camera is not wide angle. You just turn that way, and there is a single tree or a bear you want to take a picture of. You turn your whole camera, you look through the viewfinder, and now you see a road or a car or a house or something. So the camera has a viewfinder, and that viewfinder is similar to your ham radio as it's being tuned. As you tune your ham radio, you just select somebody else's transmission from the band. So you delimit the frequency your radio will process. So as you just pick out this much of a signal, suddenly you only pick out this level of the available noise components. Because the noise is broadband, it's from audio frequency up to the frequency of light. It's present everywhere, and your antenna would just feed your radio with an extremely broadband noise component. In a single sideband receiver, by not having to monitor the whole wide bandwidth of the AM signal, you only monitor the narrower bandwidth of the SSB signal, you diminish the noise pickup of the receiver, and apparently you are better off because your receiver would have less background noise, so the important signal you want to hear, you'll hear it better because it's not surrounded by noise. ESB and SSB signals used on a spectrum analyzer. See, the intelligence has all different frequency components. As I talk now from my mouse, frequencies from perhaps 100 Hertz up to perhaps past 5 kilohertz are being launched. But the human mouse and the human ear are mismatched. Over time, scientists studied this and concluded that the human mouse is capable to transmit higher frequency signals, but the human ear is not capable to hear them well and understand them well. So, because the mouse has a broad characteristic and the ear has a narrower characteristic, the ear is not so sensitive at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kilohertz. So it was decided that let's just concentrate on the overlap. So in ham radio, the overlap was set from 300 to 2500 hertz. So as I speak, I may even transmit in my speech 200, 250 hertz components and 3000, 4000, and 5000, 10,000 hertz components, but you cannot hear them anymore, nor can I. So us humans, we are not very good at hearing as we speak. So we speak and we transmit higher frequency components, and the ear can really just hear lower frequency components. So in a ham radio, the bandwidth of the audio is always restrained. And that's what is represented. This little pocket says that there are some powerful low frequency components in the neighborhood of 500 hertz, and then some weaker at 1000, and even weaker at 2000, and even weaker components at 500 hertz. So this is the frequency spectrum of the audio. Here is the carrier wave that's generated in your ham radio. As you tune your ham radio, say you have an HF radio, and you are scanning through the 40-meter band, you are tuning your ham radio. And if you would have a spectrum analyzer to see what you are generating, you just would see this. What is this again? Well, a sinusoid has voltage and it produces current in a circuit. And you multiply the effective value of the voltage with the effective value of the current, and what do you get? You do not get the effective power, there is no such thing. You get the average power. And then what do you do with the average power? And you take the logarithm of it, reference to a millivolt, and multiply it by 10. And then you get something called dBm. And this is what's represented here. So the carrier is placed on the monitor of a spectrum analyzer as the representation of the power expressed in dBm. And the carrier frequency and the audio frequency, they are added to produce this upper sideband component. And then the two components are also subtracted to produce the lower sideband component. So there will be upper sideband and lower sideband, and here there is no carrier. So what happened to the carrier? Remember that the marvelous stage called the balanced modulator would play a trick to the carrier, that it would develop the carrier in phase and out of phase, and the in phase and the out of phase components would cancel out. And by cancellation, the carrier disappeared. So when there is no power invested in the carrier, where does all that power go? Into the sidebands. So now the sidebands are bigger. And once the sidebands are larger, if you would radiate this signal, you would already gain extra range. But now, however, if you would grab one of the sidebands, either the lower or the upper, whichever one, if you manage it to put it on the top of the other sideband, now you have twice as much power. And insofar the intelligence carrying capability of the upper or the lower sideband, they are the same. So we in turn use upper sideband and lower sideband transmissions for the advantage we gain having extra gain. We'll stop here soon. We'll show you another spectrum analyzer display of a dual sideband signal. A spectrum analyzer, particularly the new ones, the recent ones, they do a procedure called fast Fourier transform. And in fast Fourier transform, samples are taken from the signal. And those samples are being processed by a microprocessor, a special one called the digital signal processor. And that takes time. So very often, the spectrum analyzer just does not have time to show every single adjacent frequency component. See, my hands would be the upper sideband and the lower sideband. But because those frequency components are fairly high, it takes lots of processing by the spectrum analyzer. The spectrum analyzer would just monitor the whole block. So there are individual fingers there, but we are happy to just see that about from here to there we have a sideband. So that's what's represented here. The upper sideband and the lower sideband has a very dense population there. There are very dense, very nearby components, but a computer would need extra processing time. And to make it more real life, then imagine that this is the lower sideband, while the spectrum analyzer would just combine it all into one envelope. And we eliminate one or the other, and then we have a single sideband. This is a good time to stop. Angle modulation is coming up, so let's take a short break. Yes,
So with an AM radio, when you change the channels, you're not changing you're changing the carrier frequency.
It's correct. That carrier frequency has many different wonderful names. When it comes to a radio receiver, we'll call that the local oscillator. So when you're tuning your radio receiver, you are changing the frequency of a local oscillator. And the local oscillator would continuously match a frequency that's coming in through your antenna, which you want to receive, with an offset. That offset is built in the radio. It's called the intermediate frequency. So we will get to that, of course, when we look into the receiver. But now to look at that, every receiver tunes exactly, precisely to the signal you want to receive. And those signals, they may come in at all different frequencies in all different bands. So to standardize the receiver, to do most of the amplification and filtering and the demodulation all in one place, the standardization led to a so-called intermediate frequency. That's a fixed frequency in the domain of hundreds of kilohertz or so many megahertz.
Within a range.
Within a range. So when you tune your local oscillator to match the frequency of the incoming signal. And then your receiver is being told, this is coming in, but I will combine this now with my locally generated signal to get that standard value for you. As you build a whole house, you like to use standardized bricks. So you standardize your material down to the so-called intermediate frequency, just to invest all of your gain all into the same area, into the same stage, and you use all of your filtering at a fixed frequency, crystal filters for one. That's all done.
And we'll come back to that, right?
We'll come back to that, yes. This was just a look ahead into receivers.
One thing I didn't
No thanks, I need water.
We're gonna have to. Hey Bruce,
Joe, do you want a cup?
can you cut 1 second? What I'm gonna have to do is get Peter, okay, to see if he can actually go and kind of stay within this range here, because I can't move it. I've been going like this back and forth, and I can't.
Oh, not to.
Yeah, so he needs, like right now, like he's sitting down there. If he could take the keyboard, even if he put the chair right where that piece of paper is, right there in the corner, and then that way, if he sits down, no big deal. But we're gonna have to put somewhere, like, because both cameras are kind of hard to.
Okay, so you're moving like over here.
Yeah, a little bit more, right where that white piece of paper is, roughly.
That's Joe's.
we built
Is that good?
Yeah, see that's better there. If he's in that area, like if he goes between there, and we'll have to put that other chair there, and just tell him. Basically, what was that? I don't know what that was.
This chair?
Yeah, so put that over this way a little bit more.
Over this way?
Right there is good. Right there. If he's in that little area,
Between the two chairs.
yeah, if he stays in that little area, he's good.
Coffee, guys? No coffee?
Not for me, I got water. Some water.
Oh, you wrote them down already?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, I gotta stop this feed here. Stop stream.